Hi, I'm Karin Davidson, and I'm here at Living Energy Day, and from howtotap.com, and I'm here with Dr. Martin Mulders, and he's going to be speaking about some provocative solutions for reducing the effects of stress using integrative medicine. Dr. Mulders graduated from medical school in his native country of the Netherlands. He completed his residency in internal medicine at Presbyterian Hospital in Philadelphia, and he started his internal medicine practice in Northern California. And then what occurred is he was dissatisfied with the limitations of his training and the constraints in helping many of his patients with traditional medicine, especially when they came to him with undiagnosable diseases or not real diseases. And he started exploring and studying alternative integrative forms of diagnostic treatment. And over the years, as I'm going to stop for just a minute, Dr. Mulders, because I'm getting feedback. So if you could just turn down your, not your audio, but if you just could turn down your sound just a little bit.
Okay,
So there's no feedback.
is that better?
That's, yes, let me see. Yes, it is. Okay. So over the years as he was doing this, as he worked with a variety of patients and using the knowledge and experience he gathered, his approach to health, wellness, and chronic disease changed drastically. And from an endpoint or an oriented pathology-based linear diagnostic and treatment approach, he changed to a more system-based approach of diagnosis and treatment that takes multi-causality, function, and individuality as its core. Pretty much the person as a whole based on their whole history and what they've gone through and what they've experienced. And he's now attracted many chronically ill patients that nobody else seemed to assist, and they've seemed to have lost hope. And he has helped them back on the road to health and wellness. So thank you, Dr. Mulders, for coming here on Living Energy Day, and welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, Karin. It's a pleasure.
So can you start off, and remember to keep the microphone, don't pull it though, yes. Could you start off with explaining about today's stressful environment and then the physical problems you see in your patients because of it?
Well, you have to almost start off defining what stress is.
Sure.
Usually when we talk about stress, we think that we have relational stress, stress at work, stress in traffic, and things like that. But stress is really anything that puts a stress not only on our emotional, but also on our physical and biochemical body. So in one way, an infection is stress. An allergic reaction is stress. So there's various things that create stress in the body. Smelling a bad smell creates stress. So there's a lot of things that create stress. And of course, nowadays we're bombarded with all these kind of stresses and a lot of stresses that 100 years ago we didn't have. There were less chemicals, there were no drugs that people were given, traffic wasn't there, we had better day-night rhythms. Nowadays our day-night rhythms are very disturbed. So all these things, create a stress on our total physiology of the body. And so when we talk about stress, it's not just that limited way we look at it. When we talk about that, like, oh, I'm very stressed. And what I found over the years working with ill people is that when your body, your total body physiology loses its reserve and adaptability, things become stressful that didn't used to be stressful. Like for example, you may have a challenging thing at work that you may actually see as a challenge and is exciting, but 10 years later, when you're tired and you're not sleeping well and you have other problems, suddenly that same event you experience as stress.
And yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And earlier today we were talking with the suicidal person, John Staples. He's a specialist in helping that, and he talked about Peter Levine and how the tiger is chasing you, and blood leaves your frontal cortex, and you become stressed because you need to run. But now we don't have that threat anymore. So it's now emotional threats, like you said, or environmental threats, and it's more constant than a tiger. Because we have, like you were saying, the environmental impact on us, as well as eating too much processed food is a stress, or whatever it is, we have all this stress. So what occurs in the body when that happens? What kinds of things do you see?
Well, I mean, of course, when the body is under stress, you know, one of the glands that responds to that is our adrenal glands. You know, the adrenal glands, they have two levels to it. One is the cortex, which produces steroid hormones, and one of them is cortisol. And then the medulla, the middle part of it, creates adrenaline and noradrenaline. Yeah. So when we get a stress response, we can have both of them happening. Yeah. And actually, these hormones help us deal with the stress.
Okay.
Not necessarily bad. I actually see a lot of people where this has happened so many times that the adrenals got kind of tired and they get burned out. And then people say, I feel stressed, but they feel stressed because the adrenals can't keep up. You know, they can't respond adequately anymore. You know, because that is in a way what creates stress when our body can't respond adequately to the challenge, be that a emotional challenge, a physical challenge, or even just a drop in your blood sugar.
Okay.
You know, when we eat sugary foods and our blood sugar goes up real quick, and then the body responds and the blood sugar drops. And what we say, well, oh, we get hypoglycemia. Well, it's an alarm for the body. The body needs to have your blood sugar at a certain level. So what happens, the adrenals, they squeeze out cortisol and sometimes adrenaline. And the function of that is to mobilize fat that then in the liver gets converted into sugar, and it would keep the blood sugar even. So, but when that happens many, many times, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
several times a day, the adrenals tire out. And sometimes when people, they may not have necessarily an emotional or physically stressful life, but this is happening all the time. And over the years, these adrenals just wear out. You know, and in the end, then the cortisol that our adrenals make plays an important role in the energy production in the cells inside our mitochondria. Yeah, the mitochondria are the little power plants inside the cell. It's like every cell has it. You know, the muscle cells, and healthy muscle cell might have 2,000 of them. Brain cells have a lot. Our brain is the most energy using cells in our body. So what happens when then the glandular function goes down, like the adrenals wear out, then the body can't produce energy, and we start having various dysfunctions. You know, we could get fatigued quickly, we can't think straight, and of course, when that happens regularly, including an adrenaline surge, then we get palpitations and anxiety, and we can't sleep, and it's just quite a complex picture.
And all these symptoms are coming from adrenal fatigue or overuse or shut down, or they're all part of what happens when the adrenals can't keep up?
Well, you see, when you said, you know, I started looking at the body in a comprehensive way,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things we humans have to do, we have to take things apart. You know, we say, well, ooh, there is the mind-body connection. And I always say, there is no mind-body connection. Mind and the body are two sides of the same thing, but we can't grasp this. You know, in our mind, so we build up models. And so we try to separate things from the adrenals, but in the end, you have to look at the whole picture. The adrenals are just one part of it. You know, the thyroid plays a role, and our bowels play a role, and how our brain responds. Because in the end, the adrenals are guided by the brain. You know, there's the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the pituitary, and that regulates adrenals. So it's in one way very complex.
Mm-hmm.
To be practical, we have to tease it apart. Yeah, you can't. You have to kind of look where weak spots are and start supporting them.
Well, how do you do that?
Well, I mean, of course, the most important things are listening to what the patient has to say. You know, symptoms are the most important signal. And so you've heard of William Osler. Ever heard of William Osler?
Yes.
Well, he was considered the father of modern American medicine, one of the founders of Johns Hopkins. And William Osler said that the 90% of diagnosis is made with history alone. So just by listening to the patient, you know, we've gotten away from that. Now, we have, of course, many more tests available than William Osler had because he died in 1919, I think. But still, the diagnosis is often made. I always say that we have a lot of tests available that sometimes can document it, quantify it, and specify it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That when, say, for example, a person has symptoms like fatigue, they get more tired as the day goes on, they tend to have hypoglycemia symptoms where they get shaky or jittery when they don't eat in time, bright light bothers them, noises bother them. These are all adrenal symptoms. They get dizzy and lightheaded when they get up too quick. These are all adrenal symptoms. But as doctors, we don't listen to that anymore. These are too vague and fuzzy symptoms.
Uh-huh.
But when I start talking to people and I listen to them, I already know what I'm going to find. But then, you want to quantify it. So there are various ways you can do that. You can do blood testing. And some tests I find they are easier to measure in the blood. Like the certain adrenal hormones like DHEA, pregnenolone. I do some of the sex hormones like testosterone and estrogen I measure. And some I find more easy to test in the saliva. Like I do cortisol levels mostly in the saliva because that's kind of how I learned to use it. But various practitioners may use different methods for that.
So the funny thing is that, looking at your website and seeing how you see patients and things like that, you go to a regular allopathic doctor and you don't get a whole heck of a lot of time to explain yourself. Their nurses are there and you're put in a room, and then when they come in, they can be friendly or not friendly, whatever. I'm not getting into that. But even if they're friendly, they talk to you, they look at it, they're almost the whole time looking down, and there's no listening. Your first appointment is 2 hours long with you. To really hear the history of the entire person, correct?
Yeah, well, it's an hour and 15 minutes, but you're probably 2 hours in the office,
Oh, okay. All right.
But it's important to get all the details, because of course, many patients that walk into my office, they've seen already many different doctors, including orthopedists and cardiologists and rheumatologists, and of course, often psychiatrists, and they often have been given vague labels. I always say that the doctor doesn't know, he doesn't find anything wrong, but the patient is tired and they're hurting and they're depressed, and so we give them labels like chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, which in my eyes are not really real diagnoses. They're just naming a symptom with the word syndrome behind it. And we get symptomatic medication.
Mm-hmm.
But I find under these symptoms are basically just signs of a dysfunction of the whole body. An analogy that I like to use is the analogy of the bucket. I say the immune system is like a big bucket and it gets filled with stuff. Nobody has an empty bucket. We get vaccines and we get antibiotics and we eat bad food and we grow up in dysfunctional families, and all of that fills the bucket. And there comes a moment where the bucket is full. And depending on where the bucket runs over, we call it asthma, or here we call it irritable bowel or ulcerative colitis or migraines.
Mm-hmm.
It's just where the bucket runs over, because what you see a lot in people who are very sick chronically, they often start with one label. Now they say, well, I was diagnosed with irritable bowel when I was in college, and then I got diagnosed with chronic fatigue, and then and by the time they're 40, they have 40s labels, because nobody's looked at the bucket and see what we can do to strengthen the bucket or scoop some of it out.
Right.
So the bucket keeps running over, and usually the medications we give just try to put a lid on the bucket, and it just works only so much. I'm not against putting a lid on the bucket when it helps, but many times it doesn't.
Right.
You have to, start working with people in a different way.
So what are some of the ways that are different that you do?
Well, of course, you take a very detailed history.
Mm-hmm.
And so based on that, I may do a different kind of testing. There's some functional tests available. I do a bunch of stool testing, where I don't look necessarily for parasites and salmonella. You can compare them with criminals. I always say in regular medicine, we look for criminals and damage. But there are also a lot of bacteria and maybe some yeast that are not like criminals. They're just like obnoxious neighbors. Yeah? And it can make your life miserable.
Right.
But they don't damage you. Does that make sense? So I do stool testing. I do hormone testing, mostly in the blood. I do a lot for lingering infections. My practice sees a lot of chronic tick-borne illnesses, Lyme disease, and there's associated bacteria with that. I do a lot of work with food sensitivities, and then that's often the start.
Mm-hmm.
The body is kind of amazing that when you sometimes correct a few big things, the rest of it starts getting better by itself. The body has an urge to fix itself unless there is an obstacle. So in one way, what we try to do is really see what is standing in the way of correcting itself and where can we give something extra to help it. Like sometimes we give some hormones or nutrients or herbs to help the body. But the big thing is always, what do you take away? Yeah, whether that be, emotionally or in their diet, or you get rid of a lingering infection, or you at least diminish it. And when you do these things, suddenly the body starts functioning better.
Because it has the ability to heal itself because the bucket's not running over anymore.
That's correct. That's correct. And of course, there is some shrinking of the bucket with aging too.
Okay.
A lot of things that we ascribe to aging is often not aging. It's just a diminish of function, and of course some of that is inevitable with aging, but a lot of it is often caused by these other chronic stressors like infection and bad food and yeast overgrowth in the bowel, lingering viruses, things like that. And when you then diminish them, suddenly the body functions better.
So could you give us some examples, like case studies? Obviously, you don't have to use names, but what do you do with Lyme disease? What do you do with adrenal fatigue, and specific cases, so we get an idea of what is integrative?
So I draw many people in that have what they call chronic Lyme disease, and chronic Lyme disease is in conventional medicine a very controversial issue, and it's one of the most political illnesses I've ever come across, because the doctors say it doesn't exist. I mean, there's definitely enough papers published that prove that Lyme can persist even after what many doctors think is adequate treatment. So often patients come to me and they've had maybe a tick bite and they've had some symptoms. Sometimes they got treated because the test showed something that the regular doc does, and sometimes the testing is negative. The testing for Lyme is not very good in general. Right. And I don't want to get into detail about that. There's multiple tests one can do. So often then people get treated and then they seem initially get better and then they get worse again. And then the doctor says, well, it can be Lyme because we treated that. And then they go on and they see all these specialists. And when people come to me, I often find, that they have some of the symptoms we just mentioned that are, signs of adrenal fatigue. And they have digestive problems. So what I do some of these tests, like a cortisol saliva test. I check some hormones. I do a food sensitivity test. And suddenly, when I then cut some of these foods out and we give them some either natural support for the adrenals or sometimes even very small amounts of the hormones that the body is not making enough, and we give maybe some herbs or prescriptions for yeast, suddenly many of these symptoms start getting better. Yeah. And some of these symptoms, these people come in and they have like 25, 30 symptoms. When you look at the list, and of course within regular medicine, because we only look at the endpoint, when you come with your doctor with a list of 6 or 7 various symptoms, the doctor says, well, we need to take one at a time. But when you start looking at the body in a more comprehensive way, it doesn't really matter whether the patient has 6 symptoms or 30. Yeah, you just have to get to the crux of it and then start working with that. And then as people get better or don't get better, then you look at various other things. So, I see a lot of people, almost all people with chronic tick-borne illness have adrenal fatigue, they have food allergies, they have yeast in the gut. You know, sometimes I think it's all the same,
Right.
all the same. Like you might say, everybody has had trauma in the past, you know.
Right. That's what I would say. Right.
The key is more, you know, what's the details? You know, and I always find that the hard part is not figuring out what's filling the bucket. The hard part is to figure out what individual people are willing and able to do. Does that make sense?
Oh, yes.
This is not like, oh, let me give an herb or a drug or something and people get better. You know, because what we find, especially in patients that come to us when they've been years and years of illness, that many times they have enormous emotional baggage.
Mm-hmm.
I do really believe, you know, because I heard a little bit of you, the speaker that was before me, and many people with chronic illness had stuff happen in the past. I
Yeah.
mean, dysfunctional stuff, and I think it affects their immune system for life.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, many times they can't go to the emotional part of it unless you bring the physiology up to a certain reasonable level. Does that make sense?
Right. They can't handle it
They,
going to the emotional part if their body can't do it.
well, and also the doctors end up telling them that it's all emotional, all in their head. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so in my practice, I don't even start on anything like that because then they think there's another guy who thinks it's all in my head. So you need to work, you know, to be able to process trauma, you need fairly decent adrenals
Right.
to make energy. Because, you know, when your adrenals are low, you respond with anxiety very fast.
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell people when the body goes in an emotional state, it finds content for it. When
Right.
I'm anxious about everything. Work, marriage, children, you know. But when I'm not anxious about that. So, and I find often that when patients come to me, when they've done other counseling and therapy before that, it's often less effective unless you work with the physiology first. And then suddenly then they can go to these places where they have to process it. Because, you know, in chronic illness, to get people better, they have to change their view on how they live their life.
Right.
Not like this illness screwed up my life and now I just got to get better so I can go back to the life I was leading.
Right.
That's a process. It takes sometimes months and months to work with that. So, you know, and I see adults and I see even children, their adrenals are already weak. Yeah, one diagnosis that many of these kids get is POTS. Have you ever heard of POTS?
I don't know what POTS is.
Stands for postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Yeah, and so these children, they're tired, they get palpitations when they get up too quick, they get dizzy, and you know, in conventional medicine, they usually treat them with stimulants to kind of prop them up. And there's not really a cause. They call it a functional disorder. Now, when I see these children, like I do saliva testing on them, and their cortisol is already low, and they're only 9 years of age.
Wow.
Really quite amazing. And so what I find in these children, many of them had, you know, a lot of ear infections, and they got a lot of antibiotics. They're eating crappy food. Some of them have underlying infections like Lyme, or one common one is Mycoplasma pneumonia, which is a very common recipe, and it's persistent. So when you then start working with them by eliminating that and at the same time support their adrenals, these children can get better sometimes in like 6 months. You know, otherwise they'll have a life of fatigue and problems, you know, because it needs to be corrected and because otherwise it can't get better.
We talk about that too much cortisol is a bad thing because it runs too high. And what's interesting is you're finding that the cortisol can be too low because the adrenals aren't producing it.
Yes.
So how would you, and I know that I know that you study a lot of different things so that you always stay on top of what's going on. And I also know that you try some things on yourself.
Yeah.
before you give it to your patients.
Mhm.
Can you, I want to talk about one of them just a little bit because it is pretty different than what anybody else does. And that's the, like you said, you would give someone a small bit of the hormone. And so you, if they have low cortisol levels, you have prescribed extremely low doses of hydrocortisol, right?
Yeah, hydrocortisone. Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And I think it's very interesting the way that you explain that, so that you can help the body lift the cortisol levels without, you're not increasing it so high that it's dangerous, but you do something like that, which is, most doctors will, when they prescribe something like that, it's a prednisone or, something very strong,
Yeah,
and, which is going to do something different that has other side effects. How
yeah.
did you find that?
Well, there's actually a book here by a Dr. Jeffries. This is a book here. It's called The Safe Uses of Cortisol. And it was written in 1981. So this
Wow.
is nothing new.
Right, nothing new.
So the difference is between looking at pharmacological doses of steroids and physiologic doses. It's a very different thing. So when I tell people I want to put them on hydrocortisone, many of them say, whoa, it's a steroid. That's bad for you.
Right.
I always tell people, you're very right when you look at it the way most doctors write for it. So I would say 99.9% of the time when doctors write for steroids, they give it in very high doses. And the reason why they give it is because something is going haywire in the body. Poison ivy spreading all over, asthma, you can't breathe, you have inflammatory arthritis, bloody colitis, MS is getting worse. So something is happening in the body and the doctor doesn't know what's triggering it, and they need to put a stop on it. So what they do, they flood the body with steroids. So when a person gets an average amount of, say, prednisone for one of those, say, these dose packs where you get 4 pills and then 3 and 2, well, the first day you get about 5 to 10 times more steroids than the body normally makes in a day.
Yeah. Yeah.
A couple of days, usually not such a problem. But when you do that for any extended time, you're going to shut down your own production because there are feedback mechanisms in your body that regulate the right level of hormones. It happens with your thyroid and your sex hormones and also the adrenals. It's feedback mechanism.
Sure.
So we're going to shut that down. And of course, when you take steroids in these high doses, you get weight gain, your blood sugar goes up, and you suppress your immune system too. And, many people develop bone loss. So that is what happens when you take high doses of steroids. But on the other hand, our immune system needs cortisol. We need it for energy production. It's an anti-inflammatory. So it's a matter of balance.
Mm-hmm.
And I use the analogy of water. If you're thirsty and I give you a glass of water a few times a day, that's perfectly okay. But if I put your head in a bucket, you're going to drink, but you're going to also have some problems.
Exactly.
That's what we do when we give high doses of steroids. And the programming about steroids is so great that many times people can't get beyond it, even medical people. Right. Medical doctors don't even know how much cortisol is made in an average day. No idea. I didn't know that. You don't get taught that. You just learn how to prescribe it.
Okay.
So, of course, estrogen is a steroid, testosterone is a steroid. There are adrenal steroids like DHEA and pregnenolone that you can buy in a health food store. But when it comes to cortisol, we have this thing because we heard, it's a stress hormone. It's not good when it's high.
Right.
It's okay when it's high in acute stress, but it's not good when we're under constant stress. Like I look at Wall Street level, where you have to be on alert all the time, or armed forces walking over the street and never know whether they're going to step on something or whether the little boy across the street has a bomb strapped around. You get this acute awareness. And then these high cortisol levels, they do create an enormous stress. They contribute to PTSD and all kind of other problems. Yeah, it affects the brain. We find that high cortisol levels play a role on the long run with dementia too.
Mm.
So what I find often is that the time when I see that all this chronicity has often wore the adrenals out. Yeah, so it's not a matter that it's one or the other. Usually the wearing out is after the high for years and years and years.
Sure.
And so what happens is then when your adrenals are low, the body can't respond to stress. You know, where a little thing that used to be an exciting thing, suddenly you don't want to do it anymore because it stresses the body. Yeah. A nice analogy I always use is the idea of a checking account. So a person with healthy adrenals has enough money in their checking account. So they just live their life and they spend whatever money they need, but then suddenly an emergency happens and they need more money. So it turns out they have money in their savings account. You know, every organ in the body has reserve. Our heart has reserve unless you have bad heart failure. It can work harder than it does. Does it make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Our thyroid has reserve, our brain has reserve, and of course, as we age, we lose some of the reserve. We lose some reserve, and sooner or later, we lose that much, we're going to die. But some of that reserve is not necessarily aging, it's just because it's stressed too much. So the person who has healthy adrenals, he has enough money in his checking account, his money in his savings account, so there's more need. They get an automatic overdraft, and then the stress goes away and it replenishes. Well, a person who has weak adrenals doesn't have enough money in their checking account. So they learn to live with less. Easy to do. And then you see that many people, well, I'm doing less, I have to take it easy. But if something suddenly happens to them, there is no reserve. They're already working at 90% or 100% of their capacity just to get through the day. You know, so many people with this adrenal exhaustion, every day they just get through the day. I got to another day. Sometimes they make it till dinner, sometimes they make it till lunch. And so when something happens to them, their savings account is empty. There's nothing. But I say if there's a real emergency, the bank will give them credit, you know, borrows them some money for an hour or so. And so when people with weak adrenals, when they get under a lot of stress, they can respond to it, but then they're wiped out for the next day or the next few hours or whatever.
Right.
Very, very common. See, and when I ask these symptoms to people, people say, oh, yeah. And then I know already what I'm going to find. The test is just there to show it black and white on a piece of paper, you know, and then you can explain that whole principle. So these hormones, steroids are not bad. We can't live without them. It's just that as in the regular medical community, the way we've been taught to use them is in a pharmacological way, not in a physiologic way.
Okay.
Sense? And you know, and it's a skill you learn how to work with that. So for example, if a person has low cortisol, say even with the adrenals working to the max, they're only making 50% of what they need. So they're tired all the time, and bright light bothers them, and noises bother them, and stress makes them worse. Everything, all that. Waking up in the middle of the night is also an adrenal symptom. When you give them a teeny bit of hydrocortisone, one, they'll have a little more, so they feel better. Yeah. But at the same time, you give the adrenals a little bit of a break, because it's very hard to recover when you're going to the max all the time. Right. When you're doing your utmost, there is no room for recovery. And so by giving them the hydrocortisone and, you know, and sometimes some herbs with it too, there are various wonderful natural products that can help, then you both feel better and you give your adrenals a chance to recover. And often, you know, especially with these children, it's often for 4 or 5 months, and then they kind of get better. You know, they have more regenerative capacity than when you're in your 50s like me.
Right, exactly.
It could be, and of course, you have to create circumstances in which the body can heal. You know, and part of that is vitamins, diet, you know, what you work with, a lot of emotional issues. They're all circumstances that can either aid the body to get better or inhibit the body to get better. And of course, the key is how you make that practical.
Because you have to do it. So if it was me, I would have to make those changes.
That's correct. And you know, you can't, as a practitioner, you can't do everything.
Right.
You can't be, it takes, you know, that's sometimes the problem is that it's a complex thing, but there's only so many things one practitioner can get good at. You know, it takes a lot of time. You know, it's not like, oh, I read about an herb and I start using it. I find in my experience that sometimes it takes a year for me to figure out whether there's something really to something. I mean, like you start using an herb or a product, and after 6-7 months you say, you know, I'm not sure that did much.
Right.
So it takes time, you know. I'm sure the technique you teach, you know, just by going to a weekend seminar, you're not suddenly good at it. Does it make sense?
Yes, exactly.
Many people go to a weekend seminar and they start doing it, and then after 2 months they get frustrated because they don't have the results. Does that make sense? So it's
You're right, exactly.
this and you know, it's almost like when I was in classical homeopathy. You're familiar with that?
Mm-hmm.
The oldest guy does the best because he has the most experience.
Right.
And I have to say that I get that feeling a little bit about myself. I've been doing this integrative medicine for 23 years, and there's just a lot of things I can't really explain. You know, you just talk to a person and you just know. And sometimes you can't explain why.
Right. Well, that's why you take the test, though, because then you get it in black and white.
That's right. That's right. And, you know, for the patients, you don't need to get everything black on white.
That's good.
You know, the moment and you can get everything black on white because it's too complex. You know, sometimes the black on white is to get the confidence of a person. You know, in the end, of course, the confidence you get when they start getting better.
Sure.
They have to give you an initial confidence. What I'm doing has to fit within their worldview. If what you try to do doesn't fit within their worldview, they're not going to do what you ask them to do. I mean,
so now you're having to learn not only about their physiology and what's going on physically and chemically, but now you're having to see if it works within their belief system or what they're capable.
Absolutely. I find figuring out what people need to do is the easy part. Usually I do that after 10 minutes.
Right.
So much of that hour and a half or the hour and 15 minutes I spend is to give the patient an opportunity to tell it all because they haven't had that. That makes sense. Many people, they never had the opportunity to talk about their symptoms because when a doctor listens to a symptom and he already knows very quickly that he's not going to find anything within the tools that he uses, he'll shut it off. He'll ignore it because it's too confusing to the regular physician to start considering things that you don't have any tools for.
Right.
So an important thing is that the patient can, you know, name all their symptoms. And if they don't, I ask for them. But the important part of that first visit, that I have to figure who people are and what they're able and willing to do. Because if you ask them to do more than they can do, you make them worse because they're going to give up.
Right.
If you ask them too little, they're not going to get better either. And it's a process. Some people, they do everything you ask them to do. And other people, you have to just pick and choose. You know, and that's a skill. I'm sure you have similar things in what you do.
Oh, yes. A lot of people can't do what they need to do. So you figure out what they can do that's going to help them be better because they can't do what they're supposed to do.
That's right. And you just hope that these first things you do, that it makes them feel better because that motivates them.
Yes, exactly.
And so I found my biggest power in enrolling people is by using analogies.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you look at the system's point of view, you know, the system's point of view is not rocket science.
Right.
You know, we use that in our marriages, raising our kids, running businesses. It's always individual, multifactorial, and we adapt to the situation. The only science where that doesn't happen is medicine. Medicine keeps making diagnoses at the end point where it breaks. Does that make sense?
Right.
It looks where the bucket runs over, but not what's in the bucket, pushing it to run over. And so we in medical school and in our training, we are not taught a way to approach that. You know, you need to be taught a way to approach it. You know, our approach is only doing x-rays and blood tests and doing a few measurements like blood pressure and heart rate. And then we look for damage, liver function tests, you know, tumors, ulcers, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Can't find anything, then we give it one of these famous names like fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue. And then then we do give drugs to control symptoms or tell people they have to learn to live with it.
Ooh.
So it's in one way sad that, you know, the medical community, they're all very intelligent, devoted people.
Yeah.
But because the pressure they're under, first, because the system that works for some things, I'm not saying that regular medicine is not working, it works for some things, when you as a doctor get confronted constantly with problems that you can't do anything about, you're going to shut yourself emotionally off for it. You can't handle it. You know, another person that's tired, another person that's depressed. You know, these patients that keep calling you because their pain is still there. Many people stop calling. So you develop a way to shut it out. You write another prescription. I remember when I was still doing just plain internal medicine, I always loved when a new anti-inflammatory came out. Because you could try it.
Yeah.
When the patient said, should I not see a rheumatologist? And I knew what the rheumatologist is going to do. I don't think he's going to have enough. But then they would be out of my office for a couple of months.
Wow.
Does it make sense? And then they would come back and they say, yeah, he tried this anti-inflammatory. That is, are you better? Well, not really.
And that's when you started looking elsewhere is because of these things.
You know, and I thought that can be, you know, that especially with these functional disorders, can be all, you know, the relationship with your husband or stress.
Mm-hmm.
So that's when I started looking into more. And I actually didn't know where to go. And I started going to chiropractic nutritional seminars. You know, and I'm from the Netherlands. We didn't have chiropractors in Holland. So I didn't have an opinion about it. The medical community in the early 90s didn't have a positive opinion about chiropractic.
Right.
I didn't have an opinion about it. So it was very interesting. And you know, and then you start working and then the patients start challenging you. You know, I'm still challenged every day. You know, my wife always said, don't get involved in too many new things because it overwhelms you. But it, you know, first I'm excited about learning more and more. But also, but it can be overwhelming because you never really can get into things deep enough. You know, and that's but it's fascinating too.
Well, one quick case study that I know about came to you, and she was a smoker, and she said that when she smokes, when she stops smoking, it's not just irritation, but she feels like suicidal thoughts or like she didn't want to live. She says, it's like my brain shuts down. And what she said about you was that, you know, when she told you that, you know, that there's something wrong, there's something not firing, you said, well, we can test that.
Yes.
And you know, because that's what she thought and that's what it feels like to her. And it didn't matter if it was tobacco or if it was addiction or anything like that. The symptom was, it feels like my brain is shutting off or there's something off.
Yeah.
And you did the test and it turned out to be extreme low GABA.
Yes.
And so you started giving her doses of GABA over a period of time and the cravings for the cigarettes ended.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah.
But it was because you listened.
Yeah. Well, and you have to be willing to look further. You know, the whole idea of addiction is actually very interesting. You know, a lot of the work in addiction and the treatments are much based on trying to control things. And you always wonder, what's physiologic going on, why one person is addicted and the other one doesn't get addicted.
Right.
What in the physiology? And of course, once you're addicted, it has enormous social and emotional consequences. You know? People dysfunction, their relations fall apart. And when you try to keep fixing the relationships and controlling the urges without correcting the physiology, you know, in the early 90s when I got into this, I got a book, was called by a PhD, her name was Larson. And she wrote a book called 7 Weeks to Sobriety. And at that time, you know, as an internist, when you deal with alcoholism, you know, you just give them Librium. And you know, that wasn't very successful. I mean, there was a lot of recidivism, and I wasn't into like rehab at all. And so at that time, my boss in California, he had a counselor coming to him that worked with young people to doing drug rehab. And he wanted to apply these methods of alcoholism to these young people. And he said, you know, do you want to do that? And I say, I don't really want to do that. And he said, well, here's the book. If you're interested, just, you know, look at it. So a few days later, I opened that book, and the introduction, they had a drug rehab, alcohol rehab program that they claimed they had like an 80% clean rate after 2 years. And I never heard of anything like that.
Right.
But the introduction in the book was written by a physician that worked there. And he said, when we look at people that come in that are hooked on alcohol, we find, and we evaluate, we find that all of them have one or more of the following 5 things. He said 90% are hypoglycemic, a few are diabetic and don't know it. So they have blood sugar handling problems. Many of them have yeast-related problems. They have food allergies, nutritional deficiencies. And if they corrected that, suddenly they had a much easier time getting off alcohol. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, you know, and I thought, wow, I do that already for people with, well, at that time, not Lyme disease, but fibromyalgia. It's really all the same. It's just that in those people, it creates this imbalance in the brain that somehow the alcohol covers up a little bit. Does that make sense?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Again, hypoglycemia, you crave sugar because it alleviates it quickly, but it doesn't solve it. In one end, on the long run, it aggravates it. You know, that's the interesting thing when you actually go back to the physiology you had in medical school or pre-med. That's how you help people on a functional level. But as physicians, we forget all about that.
Right.
Once you get from pre-med into med, forget all about that, and then it's all about surgeries and drugs, and you forget.
Well, I for one am glad that you live near me, because I want to send some of my clients who have chronic diseases and chronic, you know, situations, that I know that all this emotional work has come to a halt.
Yes.
Because it's physiological. There's something that they need to do, and they've been to a ton of doctors, and you know that nothing, that it's not been helped.
That's why.
So I wish there were more of you. And I also want to tell people, because we're coming to a close here, is if they want to read more about you and what you do, your website is Dr. Mulders, DrMulders.com.
Yes, yes.
So, and I want to thank you so much for being with us and sharing.
Good, you're welcome. Also, from Monday to Thursday, I have between 7 and 7:30 in the morning, I have an open phone hour where people just can call me. You know, if they think, well, oh, could he help me? And, you know, it's just a few minutes. I'm not going to, you know, people that I'm not familiar with, I'm not going to give medical advice. But we have often people call and just they want to kind of, that I can hear what the problem is and say, well, yeah, I can work with that. And sometimes I can. So I rather tell them that up front.
Good. So that's between 7 a.m. and 7:30. Yeah. And I know that's on your website as well.
I think
time and phone number.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much. I appreciate you doing this, and go out there and save the world, you know, one person at a time.
Thank you so much, Karen.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.